And you might be wondering why on earth I'm doing this training. Professionally, I've dealt with hate crime, but I'm also somebody with lived experience of hate crime. Neither of those things make me an expert, though. I don't think anybody is an expert. And for those of us who have experienced hate crime, this is going to be different in terms of exactly how it manifested for us, how it impacted on us, even if it's the same strand or type of hate crime. So I'm not here today to tell you how to think, how to feel, how to respond, or to provide everything there is to know about hate crime, because that would be impossible in an hour. What I am going to do is cover off some of the relevant definitions, concepts, and approaches that might help our understanding and our response to hate crime. So before we start, I'm just going to share again because my screen isn't sharing because I didn't click OK. Okay, sorry. This is going to happen a couple of times. Before we start, as I've mentioned, some of us here today as we speak, so to speak, so please take care of yourself. This could be a really triggering session for you. There are links on information at the end on support, and some of the agencies listed also provide more in-depth focused training. So if you want a bit more after the flavour today, do some research from those slides. These are the aims and objectives that we're going to be covering off today. What is hate crime? How does it affect? Who does it affect? How does it impact on those people? And an element of tackling hate crime. So I'm going to look at a model of understanding that will also help us think about interventions around hate crime. And then there's Bristol-based services, further resources. So we're going to start with what is hate crime. Here is the legal definition. Any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a person's race or perceived race, religion or perceived religion, sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, disability or perceived disability, and any crime motivated by hostility or prejudice against a person who is transgender or perceived to be transgender. So wow, that is a massive definition. It's actually one sentence, which really doesn't help with accessibility. It's very wordy. So part of what we're doing today is unpicking that definition and addressing the elements within it. So as you can see, there are 5 strands here: race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and transgender identity. And we're going to look at those in more detail. The definition's talking about criminal offences. So even though you might be experiencing discrimination of some sort, that might not come under the title of a crime. Again, we're going to look at crimes in a moment. Firstly, it's important to say that hate crime is different to most crimes, because with most crimes, it's something the victim has in their possession or their control that motivates the offender to commit the crime. But with hate crime, it's about who the victim is or what the victim appears to be that motivates the offender to commit the crime. Who the victim is relates to those 5 strands. At the point of reporting, hate crime is self-defined. The police and other agencies must treat any crime report as a hate crime if the person reporting believes they or someone else was the target of a crime because of their identity. So in summary, this massive definition that's so wordy, the basis of it is a criminal offence with a biased motivation equals a hate crime. Luckily, I found this little slide, which I think is much more accessible in terms of explaining it. And accessibility is really important in helping us understand and therefore report hate crime. So this sums hate crimes up nicely. It shows that hate crime can include threatening behaviour. It can include violence, it can include harassment and damage to property. And there I'm thinking about an example being the first Muslim leader of Oldham Council last week who had a car deliberately firebombed in an arson attack. So that was an example of damage to property under the banner of hate. What this poster doesn't cover is robbery, assaults that might not be seen as violence, terrorist offences that might be hate motivated, and also inciting others to commit hate crimes, which we'll look at shortly. So simplifying things is good for accessibility, but we need to make sure that when we do that, we don't miss out crucial elements. The little explanation paragraph at the top, I think, is really accessible, much more accessible than that legal definition on the earlier slide. So let's look at the three main types or categories of hate crime that it falls into, and these are physical assault, verbal abuse, and incitement to hatred. So we're going to start with physical assault. So any physical assault is an offence. And depending on the level of the violence used, a perpetrator might be charged with common assault. So for example, spitting, pushing, slapping, ABH, so actual bodily harm, or GBH, grievous bodily harm. ABH and GBH are criminal offences under a really old law from 1861, the Offences Against the Person Act. The difference between them, between ABH and GBH, is the degree of actual harm that's inflicted. So GBH is more serious, as is anything of severe detriment to the victim's health. However, either of them can be committed recklessly or intentionally, with the deemed level of intention contributing to the sentence ultimately handed out. If an attack is particularly violent, premeditated, or involves a weapon such as a knife or even a plank of wood, the attack would be classified as GBH. An example of physical assault is this case in Bristol from last July, when an NHS worker was deliberately run over outside of Southmead Hospital. Now, we know that that was racist hate crime. We know that because there was also verbal assault that accompanied the physical assault of being run over. And the victim suffered a broken leg, a broken nose, and a broken cheekbone. Another example from Bristol is a guy called Michael Ricketts from a few years ago now, 10 years ago now, but a useful case to give you. He was a chap with learning disabilities, and he'd gone to the hairdressers to get a groovy haircut. He wanted track marks and things shaved into his hair. Unbeknown to him, the hairdresser shaved a smiley face into the back of his hair and the word fool because he had learning disabilities. So that was a physical assault, and that was because Michael Ricketts had learning disabilities. A couple of examples there. The next one is verbal abuse. So verbal abuse can be threats, can be name calling, and so some people don't report because they think there isn't much they can do. But we're going to talk about what you can do a bit later. And even if you don't know who verbally abused you or the person you've seen verbally abused, still report, because it can really help the police improve policing in that area and mapping, and even help things around education, you know, and targeting of education. So we know last year the guy that was run over outside Southmead Hospital also had those racist names called at him. It can be rude gestures, it can be online, it can be offensive letters, it can be text messages, it can be in person, it can be over the phone. And an example from very recently, missed their penalty shots for England last week, received online. Also an example, and this is very common, this type of thing, of people targeting people who are different because of their learning disability. But there was an incident in a supermarket a couple of years ago where an elderly man said to a man with obvious learning disabilities that people like him should be drowned at birth. He was clearly targeted due to his learning disability. But we're going to look at in a moment whether that's a crime or whether that's an incident. And then the last element is incitement to hatred. This is when someone acts in a way that's threatening and intended to stir up hatred. Again, it could be words, pictures, videos, music, including information posted on websites. It can be content that is calling for violence against a specific person or a specific group. It can be those web pages that show things that describe violence against people due to any perceived differences, chat forums, for example. So it could be leaflets through the door, it could be a speaker at an organised rally, etc. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail now around some of those concepts that we looked at earlier in the big definition. We're going to break it down. We're going to look at what any other person means. So any other person refers to anyone, so any one of us here today who feels a criminal offence was motivated by prejudice. We can report it. So any of us can report it, whether it happens to us or whether we are a witness to it. And that's a way of being an ally, and it's really important, as sometimes the victim might not recognise the hate element or might not be able to verbalise it for whatever reason. Perceived group membership. So someone doesn't have to belong to a certain group, they just need to be perceived to be. For example, someone could be perceived as a member of the gay community but isn't, but that perception has triggered the crime. Or someone could have a connection with a community and therefore be perceived as belonging to it. So for example, someone could have connections with a church because they do work in the grounds, so they're perceived as having a certain religion, when in fact they don't, they just work there, but they can still be targeted. Sentence uplift is really important. This means that where someone has been found guilty of committing a hate crime, they can receive an increased sentence compared with an equivalent offence that wasn't hate motivated. So an example of where that could have been done but wasn't is for the frontline staff at Winterbourne View a few years ago. So Winterbourne View was where we saw the panorama expose around how staff were treating people with learning disabilities. Definitely they were being targeted because of their identities. They were convicted, those frontline staff, and they were sentenced for ill treatment of people without capacity, but they didn't get a sentence uplift, showing it's not always used when it could be. Monitored strands. Criminal Justice Agency have systems for recording and responding to hate crime based on 5 strands: race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and transgender identity. However, courts can decide that a hate crime has been committed out of hostility towards any group. So, for example, in 2007, there was a murder of a young woman, a 20-year-old, called Sophie Lawrence. And that was determined to be a hate crime committed because of her membership of an alternative fashion subculture, because Sophie was a goth. So her and her boyfriend were beaten and Sophie was killed because of their identity. Interestingly, research shows that gender is recorded as a factor in over 1/3 of all hate crimes, and gender is the most common cause of hate crime against women, specifically. So misogyny, which is hatred of women, is currently being pushed to be added to the strands. And that campaign has increased in momentum since the murder of Sarah Everard. Misogyny manifests itself as degrading and threatening attitudes towards women, which often translates into violence. Scotland's already included misogyny. England and Wales are going to follow on an experimental basis from the autumn, with 7 police forces already recording this strand. And the bill to make misogyny a hate crime is currently at the 2nd reading stage in the House of Commons, so watch this space. A further point to note is that there are also powers that the police and the CPS can use to prosecute crimes against older people. Perception versus proof. Once a case reaches court, decisions are made that can have major impacts on people's lives. Therefore, someone's perception about a hate motive is no longer enough once it reaches court. Proof is now needed. Practically, that means a court needs evidence that an accused person was motivated by or demonstrated hatred around a person's identity. So, for example, through their words or behaviour. So maybe using homophobic language, racist language, disableist language. And it's also worth talking here about prejudice versus hate crime. Hate crime is a symptom of wider societal prejudice against marginalised groups. But hate crime only includes behaviours that crosses the threshold of having broken a criminal law. So we're going to look at prejudice and how prejudice can escalate to the point of a hate crime with a specific model in a few slides' time. It's worth talking about, first of all, a hate incident. So a hate incident is non-criminal, is any incident which any of us, whether we're a victim or a witness, thinks is has occurred, prejudice towards a person because of those senses. It's not really up to us to decide. Let the professionals, let the police, let the CPS to decide that. Let's get the report in, because yes, okay, prosecution can only take place when a law's been broken. We don't know all the laws. So recording incidents can really help in mapping problems, as I said, and preventing escalation, and also in taking action that can challenge and prevent escalation and also educate. So report anything you think is hate-induced, even if you don't think a crime has been committed. And for more information, the link at the bottom is a useful one to click on. So we're going to look at some related laws. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in the law. I'm just intending to simply mention some of the laws that relate to hate crime, certainly not all of them, or elements of all of them. As I say, the police, the CPS, the solicitor, and lawyer, they're the professionals who know the law and will be able to use them or invoke them. But here's a brief summary. The Public Order Act of 1986. This covers the incitement to hatred element of hate crime that I mentioned earlier. The Human Rights Act of 1998. This includes various articles that detail a person's rights, including those that are relevant to hate crime. So, for example, Article 2 is about right to life, and there I always think about Stephen Lawrence. Article 3 is right to be not to be subjected to torture or to inhumane, degrading treatment, and there I think about the residents of Winterbourne View. Article 8 is about right to respect for a person's home, private and family life. So the issues around harassment, damage to property, etc., that I mentioned earlier. And Article 14, prohibition of discrimination. And hate crime is a manifestation of extreme discrimination. We then got the Criminal Justice Act of 2003, which actually replaced the earlier one of 1988, which covers common assault, such as battery, which includes unlawful force, spitting, pushing, slapping. The updated version, this one, 2003, included disability hate crime, which was the first time this had been recognised by the criminal justice system. Section 146 of this Act creates that sentencing uplift element that I talked about earlier. And as I've already said, anyone can raise the issue of hostility as an aggravating factor and provide evidence to support that perception. So if you think there is hostility around someone's identity or perceived identity, raise it at the earliest opportunity. Be persistent, be multi-agency, don't give up. What is positive, I think, is that the court has to state openly when a sentence has been increased because it was a hate crime, and that has a declaratory effect. It tells society such crimes are wrong by naming them for what they are and allowing judges to impose greater tariffs. So in the case of murder, the life tariff can be imposed. The Disability Discrimination Act of 2005 placed a duty to promote disability equality on all public bodies, including the police, local authorities, schools, and to take positive steps to prevent disability-related harassment. Of course, we know it was replaced by the Equality Act of 2010 because that act replaced all previous equality legislation. And the Equality Act covers 6 types of discrimination: direct, indirect, associated, perception, harassment, and victimisation. Hate crime is direct discrimination. This Act protects people with protected characteristics from discrimination in education, work and services, and the 9 protected characteristics are age, gender, reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy, maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation, and of course disability, which could be physical, it could be cognitive, so like learning disability, autism, Asperger. Remember, not all protected characteristics are visible, and not all protected characteristics are considered under those 5 strands of hate crime, although remember the CPS can take things forward for other groups. Also, this Act doesn't cover other areas of our identity or character that mean we might be disadvantaged or treated differently, such as our class, our accent, our immigration status, our size, for example. We've got the Serious Crime Act, and you might wonder why on earth is Michele mentioning the Serious Crime Act. And I wanted to mention it for 2 reasons. One is it's important to know that this Act introduced the offence of coercive control, but that's only for domestic abuse cases, so it can't be used for mate crime. And we're going to look at mate crime in a moment because it's a type of hate crime. So this Act cannot be used for mate crime, even though there's coercion, there's grooming, etc. However, it might be useful to consider this Act if the person doing the mate crime or the cuckooing is a partner or ex-partner or family member. And that's why I wanted to just mention it. Are there any other laws? Absolutely there are, yes. There's lots regarding actual offences someone might be charged with. But as I said, this is just a taster. So who does hate crime affect and how does it impact? Here, we've got some police recorded hate data for England and Wales going back to 2013. And what we can see from this graph clearly is that there is an increase in hate crime across all years since recording started across the whole of England and Wales. Here's some more stats. On top of the ones you can see here, and I'm going to go through them in a second, but on top of the stats you can see here, there were just over 105,000 hate crimes recorded by the police in England and Wales in 2019 to 2020, which is an increase of 8% compared with the year before. While increases in hate crime over the past years have been mainly driven by improvements in crime reporting by the police, there have been spikes in hate crime following certain events, such as the EU referendum, so around Brexit, and the terrorist attacks in 2017, for example, the Westminster Bridge attacks and the Manchester Arena bombing, to mention just a couple. So we do see spikes. As in previous years, the majority of hate crimes were race hate crimes, accounting for around 3/4 of offences. These increased by 6% between the year ending March 2019 and March 2020. Religious hate crimes fell by 5%, down from a peak in the previous year, and that was the first fall in religious hate crimes since the year ending 2013. Sexual orientation hate crimes increased 19%, disability hate crimes by 9%, and transgender identity hate crimes by 16%. These percentage increases are smaller than in recent years. Over half of the hate crimes recorded by the police were for public order offences, and a further third were for violence against the person offences. 5% were recorded as criminal damage and arson offences. It's possible for a crime to have more than one motivating factor. For example, an offence may be motivated by hostility towards both the victim's race and their religion, or maybe their sexual orientation and disability they might have. Therefore, as well as recording the overall number of hate crimes, the police also collect data on the number of motivating factors, which if you click on the link at the top of the page, you'll be able to see. Around 5% of hate crime offences in the year ending March 2020 were estimated to have involved more than one motivating factor. Provisional Home Office figures show that since then there's been a marked increase regarding reported and recorded race hate crime across the nation, with a direct correlation with the Black Lives Matter protests and the backlash from right-wing extremists. So people are more empowered to report, but they're also more targeted. And again, look at the Home Office web pages for more information. There's also stats regarding disablerist hate crime, which has gone up locally, with Avon and Somerset Police saying this is up 20% in the last year. 10% of reported hate crimes in Bristol between January and August 2020 were disableist. And that continues to be a high risk of underreporting group. So that group underreports due to things like difficulties in identifying it, added complexities, all different things that create barriers to people reporting. And finally, these stats don't allow for the discretion that the police can use around recording when a crime doesn't fit into one of the strands. So, you know, so for example, age or sex and gender in the case of Sophie Lawrence, and her identity as a goth. So thinking about the fact that some people experience multiple strands is a good time to start thinking about intersectionality. And we're going to watch now a short film that explains intersectionality. So I'm going to hand over to you, Becky.
Can everyone see this, the film? Can you see that, Michelle?
Yes. But we can't hear it, Becky.
Okay, 1 second.
When you share, you have to click on a button in the share window.
Share computer sound. That sounds about right.
Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. Okay. So I'm now going to share again. Coming back to my slide. Okay. The link to that film is there if you want it, and that film showed how intersectionality of discrimination. So for example, being a lesbian and being a disabled person. The film demonstrated how structural forms of oppression included in the Equality Act as protected characteristics like racism, sexism, ableism, etc., create layers of inequalities, vulnerabilities, and disadvantages or advantages for certain groups. We know that not all advantages or disadvantages were covered. For example, as I've said earlier, what about class? What about accent? What about immigration status? However, the concept of intersectionality is helpful and does tie in with police recording. For example, they might record more than one type of hate crime for a situation, as they recognise, for example, that transphobic abuse and racist abuse have been directed at the same person. And another example is the Oldham Council leader that I mentioned earlier, who was clearly targeted regarding her religion, her race, and her identity as a woman. An example of how thinking about intersectionality can help us with hate crime is thinking about victims as having multiple identities, with some combinations that further disempower them. Others might privilege them in some ways. So, for example, a person who's wealthy and educated, as well as having a physical disability, might be more used to being able to and having their voice heard. So they might be able to report more than somebody with a learning disability who's traditionally been marginalised and is more likely to have communication needs. So we know about 50% of people with learning disabilities have communication differences or needs. So they might struggle with sharing their experience and reporting, etc. And if you add the layer of race, for example, you might have further life experiences that make you mistrustful of, for example, the police, and therefore not report. Or you might be an older member of the LGBT community, for example, who remembers when being gay was illegal. So here I'm only talking about the 1960s. So feeling very reluctant to out themselves by reporting their experience of homophobic hate crime. So even though their particular strand is covered, they don't report because of past experiences and fear. Other examples that might help with this concept are to consider immigration status, experience of hatred in other countries around the world, a sex worker's experience of hate crime. All of these are examples of multiple and complex identities and experiences due to these layers, which can help us understand a little more as to why we have much underreporting from certain groups. So in summary, overlapping prejudice and violence motivated crime can lead to individuals facing escalated levels of hate crime and multiple forms of it, and these can also add to barriers to accessing services and reporting. So these ponderings can help us develop our thinking about who hate crime affects and how it impacts. I found these statistics, and these gave me a little bit of hope. So 86% of people taken to court by the CPS for hate crime either admitted committing the offence or were found guilty by a jury or a judge. And the reason that gave me a little bit of hope was because I was comparing it to statistics around rape and conviction around rape, for example, which is shockingly low, as we know, and we've all seen and heard about recently with the reports coming out. So the message here is, if you don't report it, nothing can be done to help the person receiving it, on the receiving end of hate crime, whether that's you or somebody else. And I talked about mate crime earlier on. I wanted to bring it in here because we know that very often, not always, but very often, mate crime can be an element of hate crime. It can be tucked within hate crime. Mate crime is a form of hate crime. It's where people are befriended or groomed for exploitation and abuse, and they're targeted because they're particularly vulnerable. So we know, for example, that higher numbers of people with learning disabilities, learning difficulties are targeted, groomed, befriended, but is in order to commit certain crimes. So we see things like cuckooing, drug running, county lines, all of those sorts of things can come under that umbrella where there's been a mate crime element to it, where someone's been befriended. So mate crime equals fake friend. The person's only making friends with that person because they're vulnerable, because they want something from them. So we've got some examples of pure hate crime, some of hate and mate crime together. There are lots of examples. I could have used many, but I've chosen to use these. So I'm going to start with Stephen Hoskin. And Stephen was a young chap, mid-30s, who lived in Cornwall, who was targeted by a group who convinced him that they were his friends. But they were only his friends because they wanted to take over his flat, to take over his life, take over his benefits, to use him as sport when they were beating him, you know, torturing him and humiliating him, for example. And eventually they killed him. So that was an example of hate and mate crime coming together. The reason Stephen was targeted was because he had a learning disability. He was very vulnerable in the community. We've got this unnamed chap from Bath and North East Somerset a couple of years ago. This was an elderly gentleman who had learning difficulties. He was befriended and his group taken over by drug dealers. So this was mate crime because he was befriended, he was groomed. There's the hate element there because of the learning disability. There's also a reason because he was elderly, so that's why he was targeted. So the element of age and vulnerability there. At the top there we see Angela Wrightson, who was a woman again in her mid-30s who experienced hate crime that ultimately resulted in her death. The perpetrators were children, and there was also an element of mate crime in there because they befriended Angela and they hung out in her house and they drank alcohol in her house, and she really thought they were her friends, but she was very vulnerable. This is a woman who had alcohol issues, mental health issues, a slight learning disability, probably from the alcohol misuse. And then we've got at the bottom Fiona and her daughter Francesca, and this was pure hate crime. So there's no mate element to this one. Again, the perpetrators' children. This case changed history and pushed the issue of disability hate crime onto the public's agenda and onto all agencies' agendas. So they're around policing, around antisocial behaviour, and around identifying certain people as vulnerable. Their ordeal went on for over 10 years, from when Francesca was a child up to and including when she was an adult. They contacted the police 30 times, 13 in the year of their deaths. They were virtually kept prisoner in their own home from when Francesca was a child up until the point Mum took them both off in the family car and killed them both in a fire. It was a relentless stream of abuse, throwing stones, flour, just terrorising them. There was a cumulative effect, and it wasn't recognised as a disability hate crime, just as antisocial behaviour. The police were told after this that they must treat incidents of disability hate crime as seriously as they had racist, religious and homophobic hate crime. And then we've got some Bristol examples. So Camille was a Kurdish asylum seeker who was murdered in 2016 by Mr. X, a white British male. Both were residents in the same supported living accommodation for individuals with mental health needs. Mr. X killed Camille, and that was a racist hate crime. And that was despite his mental health issues, not because of them. So sometimes people's hatred is almost excused because of another form of vulnerability that the perpetrator might have. So maybe their mental health or their age, and we shouldn't do that. Hate crime is hate crime. We've got Derek. He experienced both hate and mate crime. He was a 51-year-old Black Caribbean man living in supported accommodation for adults with moderate to severe mental health issues and learning disabilities. He died as a result of a heart attack, and while his death can't be linked to his experiences of crime, there was learning around lack of understanding and recognition of the issues around mate crime, so the financial exploitation that he'd experienced by his so-called friends. And as a result of Derek dying, there was a mate crime thematic review that Bristol City Council did. And you can click on those links to get more detail of those cases and to see that review. We've got Martin, was a 25-year-old man with mild learning disabilities and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and he died in October 2018. And video evidence from the hours prior to his death showed that he'd been the subject of abuse while intoxicated. The cause of death couldn't be definitely linked to that abuse, but there were themes around mental capacity, around mate crime, substance misuse, social isolation for Martin. And of course, we need to mention Bijan Ibrahimi, a disabled Iranian refugee who was murdered in Brislington in 2013 after 7 years of reporting racist incidents and crimes to the police. An independent review found the police were guilty of institutional racism in how they dealt with this case. However, the murderer didn't have any sentencing uplift to his charge regarding hate crime. So we're going to now look at tackling hate crime and a model of understanding it and intervention. But first of all, we have to meet Mr. Mandela, don't we? Who says no one's born hating another person because of the colour of his skin or his background or his religion. We learn to hate, and if we learn to hate, we can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. So why does hate crime happen? Why does abuse and crime related to hate and people's identity take place? How, in a supposedly tolerant modern society, can we get to a place of this type of behaviour? Well, here we've got just one model that's based on the escalation model of prejudice and discrimination that a guy called Allport devised in the 50s. So he was trying to understand how on earth human society got to a place of mass extermination of Jewish people in Nazi Germany. And he devised a model that's been tweaked and updated since then. So this is a little bit of a tweaked version. It shows how prejudice can escalate to the point of actual crimes based on someone's identity, how a series of smaller steps that, if uninterrupted, if unchallenged, can lead ultimately to death, as we saw with some of the cases we've mentioned today, and so many more. As well as identifying escalation, this model can also help identify how each step could be interrupted to prevent escalation. So it's a model of understanding and a model of intervention. Of course, who you are, what your job might be, and your own identity will depend on what you might be able to achieve in terms of intervention at each stage. So it's also about being an ally. Don't leave it up to minority groups to do the intervention or interrupting. Show up, help people learn and change and grow and develop. We don't need to pass on hatred. We might have learned, and we can unlearn it. So the pyramid shows biased behaviours growing in complexity from the bottom to the top. Although the behaviours at each level negatively impact individuals and groups, as we move up the pyramid, the behaviours have more life-threatening consequences as we go up. So like a pyramid, the upper levels are supported by the lower levels. If people or institutions treat behaviours on the lower levels as acceptable or normal, it results in the behaviours at the next level becoming more accepted. So let's look at examples in each section, starting at the bottom. Biased attitudes. This is stereotyping, insensitive remarks. It could be fear of difference, non-inclusive language, microaggressions, justifying biases by seeking out like-minded people. So a bit of groupthink, echo chambers that we create around ourselves to justify our opinions. It might be accepting negative or misinformation about people or particular groups, screening out positive information, scapegoating, which is assigning blame to people because of their group identity. It could be unconscious bias. All of this creates an us and them dynamic where difference is exaggerated and similarity is minimized. And we move up to acts of bias. So that might be bullying, ridicule, name calling, slurs, nicknames, social avoidance, dehumanization, biased and belittling of jokes that get excused as I was just joking, Michele. It could be hate speech. Discrimination. This could be economic discrimination, political, educational, employment, housing. It could be about segregation. It could be within criminal justice, so disparities within that. Examples are the Jim Crow laws in the US, apartheid in South Africa, the Nuremberg laws in 1930s Germany, the signs in boarding houses here during the Windrush era, how HIV positive people were treated differently not so long ago, depending how they'd acquired the virus and their identity. Bias motivated violence. So Allport called this layer physical attack. This could be against property, like we've spoken about, against people. It can include murder, rape, assault, arson, terrorism, vandalism, desecration, threats. And an example here, there was a lesbian couple on a bus in 2019 who was subjected to homophobic abuse and harassment by a group of teenage boys. And the teenage boys wanted them to kiss in front of them, and they refused, and they were beaten up. So that would be an example of bias-motivated violence. And then we go up to genocide or extermination, as Old Port called that layer. That's the ultimate enactment of hatred. That could be for an individual, or it could be for a group. It's deliberately and systematically annihilating an entire people. So the ethnic cleansing of in Serbia, Bosnia, final solution in Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, the killing of Stephen Hoskin. We've already talked about cases where people have been killed or killed themselves due to hate crime they're experiencing, or where hate has been a mitigating factor in a death. It's worth highlighting here that wherever there's been a terrorist attack, there has always been a backlash and related rise in hate crime. It's also worth thinking about the impact at each layer. We can't rely on victims to name what they're experiencing. They might have internalized elements as their fault. They might have an impact on them mentally regarding their emotional well-being, their mental health. It might make them isolate themselves as well as become isolated. There's an accumulation of trauma that we might experience starting in childhood. So hate crime experienced in childhood is an ACE, an adverse childhood experience. And the accumulation of such trauma continues into our adulthood. So we need not to just be ACE aware, but utilize trauma-informed practice. We need to focus on becoming an ally as well. Call it out when you see it. So thinking about calling out when we see it, thinking about further intervention and thinking wider than the crime. We're going to look at resources very soon, but I wanted to say something about additional duties and responsibilities around hate crime. To remind us that some people may need additional help with hate crime. So we need to look deeper and wider than the crime. We need to think family, think community, think vulnerability. We need to think about how children are affected, how the community is affected, how people with added vulnerabilities are affected, and what our responsibilities as citizens are around these people. So we need to think about safeguarding adults, our duties and responsibilities around that. Is the person being targeted vulnerable? Do they need some sort of help with daily living? You know, maybe they've got a learning disability, some mental health issues, age-related health issues or mobility issues. If so, we need to do a referral to safeguarding adults if they're a victim of hate crime. You know, what about if the person doing it or being affected by it is a child? So is the person committing the hate crime a young person or a child, like we saw with Francesca, like we saw with Angela earlier? Is the victim a child or a young person under 18? Are they being significantly harmed? Or do they or their family need some extra help? If so, we need to make a referral to children's services. We also need to think about, is the person responsible for the hate crime someone who works with children? Because if so, we need to be making a referral, talking to the LADO, the local authority designated officer. I put a really useful leaflet there that Bristol's produced that explains the role of the LADO and how to make contact, etc. So we're going to look at Bristol-based services and further resources. Of course, there are lots of services and organisations that are helpful and have knowledge around hate crime, including but not limited to specialist police, so around using MASH, using MAPA, community safety teams, antisocial behaviour teams. We've got the Bristol Hate Crime Service, which I'm going to go through in a moment. We've got housing officers who can be brilliant at this sort of stuff, community agencies, community organisations, community leaders, you know, neighbourhood watch, all sorts of different services and resources that can help us around identifying, reporting and supporting around hate crime. So I wanted to mention Bristol Hate Crime and Discrimination Service, and there's a link to their website. This includes 6 partner organisations. Of course, you know, it was set up by Sari a long time ago. Come together with Bristol Mind, with Brandon. So there's a mental health strand, there's a Brandon Trust, a learning disability strand, an LGBT strand. They've got Bristol Law Centre involved, and they've got Resolve West involved, which were formerly Bristol Mediation. And they do all sorts of things. They do casework, they do legal advocacy, they provide information, they help empower people, they provide guidance for individuals and agencies, restorative justice, mediation, conflict resolution. They do one-to-one work with the victim, with perpetrators, with young victims. They do signposting, they have quarterly forums, and they raise the voices of victims. And they also do provide training, and I know they provided an amazing session last year, a whole day on hate crime. Other resources that we've got here for support as a victim, I've popped on some links there, some extra info on types of hate crime as well. The Bristol hate crime leaflets that's really useful, really accessible, and some resources on hate and hate crime, including leaflets and a short film on disability hate crime, which is also on the Bristol web pages. They're really, really useful, so I'd really recommend you do some clicking and have a look at that. Reporting hate crime. Obviously, it's 999 if you or someone else is in danger. 101 for non-emergency inquiries. There's a link there to reporting hate crime to Avon and Somerset Police. And in addition, that you can report hate crime to some of these organisations that have, specific targeted audiences, if you like. So anti-Muslim hate crime, anti-Semitic hate crime, etc. So there's some extra resources for you there. Interestingly, I came across this when I was doing the research for this session, that there is actually a National Hate Crime Awareness Week, which is always in the same week in October, and that's when it is this year in 2021. And there's a link there if you're interested in taking that forward as an organizer. You get some posters and all sorts of things to do some information, do some work around raising the agenda of hate crime. So as I make my closing remarks, please feel free to add any questions to the chat function, and once we stop recording, I can do my best to answer them. I'm going to play a short film as we finish, but I'd also like you to think about what you're going to do next. What will you do as a result of this training? How will you put your knowledge base to use? I'm hoping that today you felt validated in your knowledge base, but maybe you've also got a couple of extra resources. So how are you going to transfer that knowledge? How are you going to interrupt hate crime at any of those layers of that pyramid to stop that escalation of prejudice so that different outcomes can be experienced for those of us that have been on and continue to be on the receiving end of hate crime? I'd also say look after yourselves as you're going today. Again, is triggering this session. It's personal to some of us. So please look after yourselves as you go. Click on some of the resources. Listen to what Maya Angelou has got to say. Hate has caused a lot of problems in this world. It has not solved one yet. And on that note, I'm going to share a short film.
I have the right to be treated as equal.
I have the same hopes and dreams as everyone else.
I want to live safely in my own community.
Free from hate crime and discrimination.
I'm married.
My advocate helped me speak up for what I want in life.
Nothing for support me with my job and my life. I want to live an ordinary life just like you.
Just like you.
Just like you.
Okay, so thank you for your time and attention today. Thank you for the IT people who've helped me today as well. And we're going to stop recording the session now so that we can cover off any questions or comments that have been added to the chat. So if we stop.